Hi, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. It's so nice to see everyone here. My name is Rená Cutlip-Mason. I, for 3 years, had the privilege of being counsel to Juan. And so for this panel, we're going to do something similar to what others have been doing. We're going to be playing off each other, but I wanted to, whether the panelists know it or not, it was intentional on my part to do it this way because for anyone who knew, and I do have a lot of former colleagues from EOIR here, Juan's door was always open to anyone who wanted to come, and he loved to sit around and talk to people and talk about the law and think about solutions. And so that's what we're going to do on this panel as well. Questions are welcome. We will save time at the end for questions, but if you have any in the moment questions, feel free to slip me a piece of paper and I will work it into the questions that I'm asking the panelists. So I want to start by thanking Dawn for putting this together. It's amazing, and to the Center for Migration Studies. On the panel today, I have with me Eleanor Acer, who's the Senior Director of Refugee Protection at Human Rights First. Bob Carey, who is a Leadership and Government Fellow at the Open Society Foundation, and prior to a couple of years ago, he served as the Director of ORR at HHS. And of course, someone who doesn't need any introduction, Wendy Young, who is president of KIND and Juan's wife. So I want to start. We, as a panel, came up with some very big questions to talk about today, and we want to start to unpack what's happening with the flow of refugees and migrants. And we'll start with, we had some big questions that we had already laid out a couple of weeks ago, and then last Thursday and Friday happened. So last week, the administration announced some drastic measures to limit the availability of asylum to individuals seeking entry to the U.S. on the southern border. This move was in large part justified by saying that the border is in a state of crisis. And so I want to start with Eleanor and ask Eleanor, could you provide us a little bit of background about what happened last Thursday and Friday, and then we'll go into some of the bigger, deeper questions we have planned.
Hello, yeah. Thank you so much, Rená. It's really a pleasure to be here and a privilege. I want to join in thanking the Center for Migration Studies for organizing this event in honor of Juan. As a representative of an NGO, I can say it was a pleasure and a privilege to deal with a government official who was always willing to engage, as all of you know. And I look forward to talking about that more later on. So in answer to your question, so there is no crisis except for a crisis of management. And we're going to talk about that, I think, in a little bit more depth later on, a crisis, a failure to manage refugee displacement and humanitarian crisis. So basically, to backtrack a little bit and give you a very quick summary of what happened last week and put it in a little bit of a broader context, the Trump administration came into office early last year with a very long to-do list of policies that they wanted to push ahead that would block access for refugees to both refugee resettlement and to asylum. And they have executed those policies one after another. They've not been able to get some policies enacted in law, even with a Republican Congress. And so they have gone to extraordinary steps to try to rewrite U.S. law. And that's some of what we're seeing in what happened last week. The Trump administration has been seizing on the caravans as a way to paint the U.S. as in danger of invasion. And they're doing this for multiple reasons, including to advance draconian solutions, as well as for political purposes to generate fear of an invasion, particularly recently as an election was coming. The Easter time caravan, and just to sort of talk for just a minute quickly about like caravan. I know everyone's heard that word over and over and over again. Basically this is a phenomena that has been going on for a while and seems to be escalating. of people who are trying to reach the U.S. southern border, in many cases to seek refugee protection, but traveling together in groups for safety reasons instead of turning to smugglers. So it's a really challenging phenomena for many, many reasons, but just to kind of explain what these caravans are. The Easter time caravan was used as a trigger for the zero tolerance, criminal prosecution, and family separation policies, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit later. But the more recent caravans in the run-up to the election have been used to generate fear and justify these new policies that we saw recently. So basically what the administration did was to announce an interim final rule and then for the president to issue a proclamation in an attempt to rewrite asylum laws, which are very clear, through these administrative measures. An interim final rule was issued, meaning that it was not, as is typically the case, given an opportunity for there to be public comment on why the law was legal or not legal, or what would be the impact, the regulation was legal or not legal, and what would be the impact of that regulation. Instead, it went into effect when issued, and it's an attempt to bar a refugee from asylum if, and I brought this just so I can read you the language, if the alien is subject to a presidential proclamation or other presidential order suspending or limiting the entry of aliens along the southern border with Mexico, that is issued pursuant to subsection 212F or 215A1 of the Act. And 212F, as many of you know, is the provision of law that was used for the Muslim ban and refugee bans. So in addition to that interim final rule, then the president issued a proclamation, which was an attempt, which says that it suspends entry for 90 days for asylum seekers who cross the southern border unless they seek asylum through approaching a port of entry. In addition to the effort to rewrite asylum law, which is very clear in terms of allowing people who have illegally crossed the border to actually apply for asylum, the effort also tries to ratchet up the credible fear standard, essentially. So asylum seekers or refugees who are subject to this bar created by the proclamation must pass a quote-unquote reasonable fear screening, a higher standard than the credible fear screening. And if they do, they then are allowed only to apply for withholding of removal or protection for CAT. So the impact of this is huge. First of all, refugees who have well-founded fears of persecution but don't meet those higher standards are at risk of return to persecution, to their countries of persecution, despite the fact that they've got well-founded fears of persecution. Even those who manage to pass this higher screening standard and then ultimately this higher protection standard will be left in a perpetual limbo, essentially. Many will be separated from their families because their families are not protected under withholding automatically. And they cannot then go on to apply for legal permanent residence status and integrate in the ways that Congress intended refugees to be able to do. A lawsuit has already been filed by the ACLU, CCR, and the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's a clear violation of U.S. laws and treaties. There's just no question about that. And the irony here is that for months now, at the same time that the administration has been telling asylum seekers to go to a port of entry and seek protection at a port of entry, it has been simultaneously orchestrating essentially a bottleneck across all of the ports of entry. We can talk in more detail about that, I think, later on when we talk about what some of the other barriers have been. But here you have a situation where the administration is claiming their purpose is to make people go to ports of entry rather than crossing the border in between them. But for months now, and even starting last year, but for months now in a very orchestrated way, the administration has been purposely creating bottlenecks that are making it impossible for many to actually get in a timely manner.
I can't see this half of the room, so I'm going to stand up here. Now I see why people are standing up. Okay. So So this is one in a series of steps that have been taken over the last 2 years under the guise that there is a crisis. So my question is, Wendy, is there a crisis here?
No. And, you know, if I could ever get a meeting with Donald Trump, first I would go to a bar and have a good stiff drink. And then I would go to the meeting. And the first thing I would say to him is, what crisis? I mean, let's put this into perspective. Even just looking at the caravan, even just looking at the caravan, where the numbers have, you know, fluctuated a fair amount, but we're looking at roughly, what, 5,000 to 7,000, and even those numbers are starting to disperse a bit. So, you know, to put this in a global perspective, I remember when I was working at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, my first boss there was one of the UNHCR officials who had to handle the Rwandan crisis, and talked about how 250,000 refugees fled in a 24-hour period of time, many of whom were missing limbs because of the extreme violence that was going on in that situation, fears of a cholera breakout. Now that's a crisis. And for the United States, in our leadership position in this world and our long history of commitment to refugee protection, to declare roughly 5,000 people to be a crisis, it's a scam on the American people. So thanks for asking the question. The next thing I would say to Donald is the answer here is to look at the systems that are on the books to handle asylum seekers. Not perfect systems, we all know that, and many of us in this room have worked years to reform that system, but there are laws in place to process people's claims. What's missing here is resources and the political will to implement those laws. The next thing I would say to him is, if you are so concerned about crisis, why are you creating a crisis? What they have done is, for example, eliminate the CAMS program, which was the in-country refugee processing program for unaccompanied minors. You can't get better order than that. Now, footnote, it was not particularly well implemented under the prior administration, but at least it gave an opportunity for children to present themselves while still in country, avoiding the very dangerous trip to the United States, to determine whether they had a legitimate protection reason for being relocated to the United States. The family separation crisis, where we saw a big ramp up in the number of so-called unaccompanied children, by virtue of this administration punishing families who arrived at our border by taking their children away from them, redesignating them not as accompanied but now unaccompanied, thus adding something around 2,600 new unaccompanied children to an already overburdened system with the Office of Refugee Resettlement. But as a footnote, at the same time, this is an administration that is attempting to redesignate unaccompanied children, children who truly arrive at our border without a parent or legal guardian, as accompanied if they have a parent present in the United States to whom they can be released. So this manipulation of the law at an administrative level is really, to me, the greatest challenge that we're facing today. Whether it's good or not, I think we've seen that Congress has been, virtually paralyzed on immigration issues for the past several years. So this is what the administration is turning, is to finding these, what he calls loopholes that enable people to come in. He's actually finding the loopholes to prevent people from coming in. So I will stop there. There's plenty more I think that we can discuss the next hour and a half.
So I think as we as a panel talked, we called it calculated chaos. There seems to be over the last 2 years a calculation to create chaos where there are processes in place that could create order. And so it is a bit amazing how much has happened in the last 2 years. So I want to turn to Bob to talk a little bit about looking a little more in depth at Tornillo and what's been happening on the border with unaccompanied children over the last 2 years.
Sure, and it's both humbling and exciting to be between these two powerful intellects and friends. So who know these details and the details of these situations like no one else in the world. But from perspective of one who worked with and led the Office of Refugee Resettlement, I don't know what the motivations are other than what appears to be calculated chaos. But as both of my colleagues have referenced, this is a crisis that has been of the creation of this administration. Certainly there's a flow, but it's not a flow at unprecedented levels that we saw in 2014. But a number of procedures have been implemented administratively over the course of the last 2 years, which have had the effect of lengthening the stay of unaccompanied children in ORR custody. So, for example, and I would like to point out what we saw, what I saw, my colleagues saw, and some of them are here, as our mission when I was at ORR. It was to ensure the safety and security of children pending the reunification with a sponsor such that they could continue through their legal process, and doing that as effectively as we could in as little time as possible, while balancing the security of the child with the desire not to keep children in a congregate care institutional setting for an extended period of time, which we all know causes harm, and to reunite them with sponsors. So, for example, as many are probably aware, they've enhanced the fingerprint and background check processes for sponsors, but not only for sponsors, but for all members of households. So this creates, in many of these families, there are unrelated individuals who are living, they may or may not have status. So this creates an obvious impediment to the families being able to provide the documentation in order to release the child. That also adds time, because assuming you have individuals who are willing to come forward and be fingerprinted, that adds a minimum for fingerprint, as I recall, of 2 weeks to the process. And I've heard more recently, even with parents being reunified with children, it's been in some instances a matter of months while these from local service providers before the fingerprint processes are completed. Further compounding this is the information sharing agreement that was put forth between ORR and ICE, which is unprecedented, in which the background information and the fingerprint information is now shared with ICE, which I believe is also a muddying of the roles of the two entities. ORR, Congress placed the care and custody of children with ORR, and my colleagues here were involved in those processes at the time, because it is a social service provider housed within a human services agency. So it was deemed that the care and custody of children was more rightly placed in that type of setting, where that expertise exists and where that mission is consonant with the care of children, not with then INS or with any of its successor bodies. And so, to now have ORR staff gathering information which is being shared for law enforcement purposes, and we know is now being used to arrest people who come forward to sponsor children, is very much a muddying of missions, and it has the effect of placing ORR staff, social service providers, in a kind of an adjunct law enforcement role, and also delays the release of children. When I was at ORR, our average stay of children was around 33 days. It varied a bit, and it was something that we all watched. First thing I looked at every morning when I got up was average length of stay and number of children coming into custody and number released. It's now upwards of 75 days.
Which hails back to, as Wendy will know too, like in 2012, there were steps taken as children were the average stay was 75 days in the summer of 2012, which was leading to bottlenecks that we're seeing even today with that stay going up.
Right. Yeah, and I would argue that that's not with any significant, by any indicator that I'm seeing, increase in the security or safety of children. In fact, I believe personally that it's harming children. They are being kept in care for extended periods of time. I don't think, when we looked at the effect of the background checks and the additional fingerprints, and staff produced a report at one point, we found that there were, I'm guessing these numbers, they're sticking in my head, like of 20,000, there were some, under 20 hits, and they were for minor infractions like old traffic violations. So, at the time it was clear that these were not significantly enhancing the security of children. But these measures are having the effect, and I believe it's a punitive effect, of delaying reunification of children and sponsors, primarily parents. And I believe with the intent of providing a disincentive for unaccompanied children to present themselves, which is a consistent approach that we see across other aspects of the program. It's, punitive measures which are under the guise of perhaps security, but we're having really the effect of penalizing people who are seeking protection.
Absolutely. Okay, so we have a Back to the Future moment with children, and the muddying of enforcement roles, which are also leading to sponsors not stepping forward as well if they're afraid they're going to be issued an NTA. Right. We've seen over the summer separation of families, and even before that, we've seen a concerted effort over the last 18 months. A series of decisions. We've seen certification to the Attorney General. We've seen turnbacks at the border. Eleanor, do you want to address any and all of that?
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, really there's been a concerted effort to cut off access to asylum, just as we've seen a concerted effort to cut off access to refugee resettlement. The effort to cut off access to asylum comes in different forms. So first, efforts to physically block or block through various roadblocks access to the asylum system. Then as well, various measures that seek to penalize or punish people who actually do persist and seek protection. And then third, for those who actually do manage to get over all those hurdles, a number of steps that make it just much more difficult for people to actually receive asylum at the end of the day. I'm going to focus mostly on the first two, just because we don't have all day to spend talking about this. But I mentioned earlier one of the most troubling efforts is an effort to turn people away from ports of entry. So in 2017, we started noticing an increase in reports of people being turned away from ports of entry. In some cases, people were told things like, Trump says we don't have to grant asylum anymore, Trump says we don't have to take refugees, or Trump says we only have to take religious refugees. So officers sort of feeling like they were green-lighted to turn asylum seekers away from ports of entry in many ways. The Office of the Inspector General, in a report issued on family separation, made clear, actually, and publicly included a copy of materials that confirm that actually now there is a concerted effort by CBP to turn people away at ports of entry, telling them that the port is full or at capacity, to wait, to come back later. So a more sophisticated message that doesn't say go away forever, but a message that leaves many people with no choice, or leaves many people stranded in very difficult and dangerous, physically dangerous areas. There's been a really interesting statistical study I urge you all to look at. WOLA looked closely at statistics reported by CBP across ports of entry, and it revealed it confirmed this concerted effort to reduce the numbers who are actually allowed to access ports of entry, with the number hovering now about at a certain level, but representing a substantial cut below what had been the numbers who were being actually allowed to and processed at ports of entry. Instead, now we have, in many cases, CBP officers in the middle of the bridge. We have Mexican officers or Mexican contractors stopping people from even approaching the bridges, so people are actually physically prevented from getting to the port of entry. And then in different ways at different ports of entry, there may be quote-unquote lists somehow being managed for people who can wait on them, sometimes days, weeks, and more prolonged periods of time. And this purposeful bottleneck and reduction in the number of people allowed at ports of entry is happening at the same time that high-level Trump administration officials, first during the zero tolerance policy, but now too with the more recent proclamation and interim regulation scheme, at the same time that senior U.S. officials are saying, go to the port of entry, don't cross illegally. At the same time they're doing that, though, they are making it much more difficult for people to actually access the ports of entry, and also generating larger groups of people having to wait at these ports of entry. So, is one of the purposes here to generate a look of people waiting by slowing down the processing? I think that's a very real question. Along with the efforts to make it tougher for people to actually access ports of entry, we've talked a little bit about the more recent asylum ban, targeting people who cross between ports of entry. I would just note that the OIG actually confirmed that they spoke to people who indicated that they crossed between ports of entry because they weren't able to get to a port because they were turned away at a port of entry. So there's a link here. And even I think in the OIG report, a Border Patrol supervisor confirmed that actually the numbers of people crossing between ports of entry often increases when people can't get in at ports of entry. So a real correlation there. In addition, we've also seen other efforts to block access to asylum. The Trump administration has been trying very hard to get the credible fear standard heightened. They've tried to get support for legislation to do that, for Congress to change that standard. They've tried through, issuance of various memos to the Asylum Division to get them to somehow ratchet up the standard, despite the fact that Congress set the standard. And in addition, in this latest scheme, obviously, there's yet another effort to try to circumvent the statutory credible fear standard that Congress created by making people have to meet a reasonable fear standard, which is a higher standard than the credible fear standard, and then, of course, not even giving them access to asylum if they do that. In terms of the efforts to actually penalize people, so if people get through the various barrage of barriers that is preventing them from actually accessing the system, then there are efforts to punish those who do. So one of the efforts we saw with the zero tolerance policy was the effort to criminally prosecute as well as to separate families. And my colleagues have and will talk about the family separations in more detail. But one of the things the Attorney General and the Homeland Security Secretary made clear with that zero tolerance policy is that they would not exempt asylum seekers from the criminal prosecutions. They said so explicitly. And they also would not exempt parents. Now, Article 31 of the Refugee Convention, which the U.S. has signed, is very clear that people seeking refugee protection should not be penalized because of their illegal entry or presence in the country. It's very, very, very clear. Criminally prosecuting asylum seekers is a violation of that obligation. In fact, under the Obama administration, this was also happening, but not to the extent we're seeing now, but it was happening. And the Office of the Inspector General flagged that prosecution of asylum seekers through what was streamlined prosecutions could raise issues under the Refugee Convention. Among the shifts that we've seen in terms of criminal prosecutions over the last year are an increase in criminal prosecutions of individuals who've entered initial entrance. One of my colleagues was just observing a streamlined prosecution the other day and saw a group of Nicaraguan asylum seekers fleeing from the country's recent violence subjected to criminal prosecutions, in addition to the many Central Americans and Mexicans and others who are subjected to these prosecutions. This is both an issue for the Department of Homeland Security and for the Department of Justice. They are both violating U.S. refugee treaty obligations in doing these, in conducting these prosecutions. Another key way in which the administration's policies are punishing those who seek refugee protection is through detention. Now, detention obviously is not a new phenomenon. This has been a problem and a human rights abuse over many administrations in the United States. But the president in the executive order that was issued on January 25th called for detention for the quote-unquote duration of proceedings and the end of quote-unquote catch and release. And looking at their language, they seem to refer to catch and release to mean any release of anyone, including an asylum seeker who affirmatively presents themselves at a port of entry and never had to be caught, as well as an asylum seeker who crossed between ports of entry and voluntarily identified themselves to Border Patrol. And policies of the Department of Homeland Security implementing that memoranda, that executive order, have made clear that they intend to just detain everybody. So even though U.S. law, regulations, and existing policies provide for the release of individuals who meet certain criteria, this administration will not release these people. And then this is partly causing then, of course, and at the same time claiming that there isn't enough detention beds and bed space. In addition, new facilities are being built, some are open. Some of you may know this. One of my colleagues went to the Imperial facility recently, which is a 2-hour drive from San Diego along the border. There was no legal orientation presentations there. There was no pro bono lawyers of any of the asylum seekers she met with. And another facility, I think, was just opened in Arizona. Many, many people there, no lawyers, no eyes, no ears, no legal representation, no legal information. I would love to talk about the ways in which the procedures have been made tougher for people who actually, do manage to get into the system. But I'm hoping that maybe you will talk about matter of AB. And I just want to flag one of the many things that I could talk about on this, and that is very disturbing trend that we now have leaders of agencies, an attorney general that heads an agency that conducts asylum and immigration adjudications, the head of USCIS and the head of the Department of Homeland Security, all disparaging asylum claims and essentially trying to, doing things that signal to adjudicators that the claims before them are lacking in merit and should not be granted. That is very, very troubling. I mean, in fact, the Trump administration and Attorney General Sessions have made the case for an independent immigration court. I mean, if ever there needed to be evidence, just the ways in which senior government officials are trying to influence individual adjudications is very troubling. I'll leave it at that.
So as we continue to paint, and I promise the next question is going for how do we move away from a gloomy picture, but but as we continue to paint a gloomy picture, I want to add two things. One is something I forgot after Bob spoke, and maybe Wendy, you have some insight on this, but I think it was Karen this morning that talked about decreasing the use of VTC and video conferencing. What we've seen recently is an increase in that use, not only in detained facilities, not only in the IHP program, in the federal prisons, and not only in the non-detained courts as well, but we've also have started seeing the use of WebEx in ORR shelters for first hearings. Some of those hearings happening before 60 days, which was an agreement made under the Obama administration not to have the first hearing before 60 days to allow children to be reunited with sponsors and find some firm ground. There's an erosion of that agreement. They're now using WebEx in shelters, and often, and sometimes, I won't say often because I'm not sure, children having a first master calendar before they've even seen an attorney. And so just highlighting that fact as well, which is part of the gloomy picture. And then to Eleanor's request, over the last 11 months, we've seen a greater use of certification by the Attorney General than ever. And with each step, I was asked once recently when one of the most recent cases came out, so what's the so what of this? And my answer was, any of these cases in a vacuum, we can fight against, we can handle, we can combat. But when you look at each of these cases put together, it paints immigration judges into a corner to make certain decisions. And so we see Castro-Tum, which we see Castro-Tum, which was admin closure, right? Eleanor. Cast Your Tomb, which limited the use of admin closure. We've seen a limit to terminations, and I'm not even going to try with all the acronyms because I'm doing it without my notes in front of me, and leading to what I spent all of my summer working on, which is matter of AB, which was an attempt by the Attorney General to limit who would qualify for asylum under particular social group, specifically targeting survivors of domestic violence, and had some bad dicta, not only in misunderstanding and not understanding the dynamics of domestic violence, but also bad dicta around gang violence and the reasons why individuals are fleeing and seeking protection in the United States. It makes our jobs harder. I right now am at the Tahirih Justice Center. We represent women who are survivors and are seeking asylum in the U.S. And our attorneys spend a whole lot more time on cases. We have a robust motions practice now. We're doing a lot of briefing. So the work that we face now because of the last 2 years is higher, and it is a gloomy picture that we're having right now. But that said, I am, I think, forever the optimist. And so with AB, I tell folks all the time, it paints bad dicta, but it's not the end all be all. We can fight it, and we will, but that means more resources, and that's what all of our organizations are doing these days. So I want to turn from a gloomy picture and see, I would be curious to hear, I've had this conversation with them, so I know what I'm going to hear, but I'd be curious to hear whether you think there are any lessons learned, not only over the last 2 years, but over the decades that we've been seeing, but particularly over the last 2 years. What are our lessons learned? And are there programs that we think were working that should be resurrected? I know Wendy mentioned CAM. Someone this morning mentioned the family case management system, but how gloomy is it? And is there hope? And if so, what is the hope? And do you want to talk, Wendy, about the gaps in TVPRA to start?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, just broadly in terms of your question, I think that one thing that we started to reach an understanding, I think, under the prior administration, and I think certainly remains true, is there is no magic bullet for addressing situations like the flow out of Central America that we're seeing currently, that you really have to look at these issues holistically. And one of the things that I think we should really be lifting up, and it's not necessarily a natural for the immigrant rights community, I think, because it's not the space that we necessarily occupy day in and day out, but really elevating, looking at the root causes of this migration. Why are people fleeing to begin with? And investing our foreign aid strategically in the region to start to ameliorate the conditions of violence in that region. And we at KIND are now starting to craft a communication strategy around exactly that point. And I think, need to keep in mind the situation in Central America is highly complex, but these are not huge countries. They're very close to the United States, so I think we have a natural national interest in investing in those countries, restoring the rule of law, starting to build programs that focus on children, on families in the region, education, judicial systems, responsible judiciaries, responsible police forces. So that's one piece. Second, I think, is that we need to keep emphasizing, and I think this is important given where public opinion is in the United States, that we don't view this as just a U.S. problem, that other countries in the region can share in the responsibility for providing protection to people on the move. There's been greater scrutiny on the Mexican asylum system. We've seen some modest improvements there, but certainly a lot more progress can be made. The resettlement system that I mentioned earlier, to me, is just such a no-brainer. To provide people with opportunities, particularly children, because children moving alone is not a good thing. I often say the kind of migration issue that KIND focuses on is not a good form of migration. So providing people with opportunities to seek and access protection from the region. And then resourcing both the systems at the border as well as the adjudication systems in the U.S. to keep pace with what's happening, particularly the adjudication system. And this is something that others have mentioned earlier today, and certainly I heard a lot about in the evenings when he came home, was my husband's concerns about all the money kind of piling on in terms of the immigration law enforcement and the courts just kind of frozen in place. I remember particularly that period of time of sequestration when things were just really, really frozen, and he was watching those backlogs build, which, you know, I think erodes public support for the system overall, that it reinforces that impression that things are broken, that it's disorderly, that there's chaos. So I've now lost complete track of your original question, Renee. But
That's it, you're answering it. I would add to that, I'm going to jump in too, because Allie mentioned it this morning, and it's something that I had many conversations with Juan about, but if we're not going to reform the court system in a radical way, it's reforming the NTA process. And I think it was Andy this morning that mentioned, and I think it was from some notes I might have dug up, and wrote many, many times, but the idea of actually reforming how NTA, making them go through legal sufficiency reviews, and making sure that that there is prosecutorial discretion in the process.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
If we're not going to blow the system out.
And then just to mention one other, because I will be fired as president if I don't mention this, is the counsel issue. I mean, counsel not only helps adjudicators reach sound decisions, I also think it leads to efficiencies in the system. And, you know, I think on the representation of unaccompanied children, we have seen more government investment in supporting legal representation systems, and it's showing in the results. And I echo Ben in his comment that can't we at least start by focusing on the Franco population, individuals with mental disabilities, and children who are trying to navigate these very complex procedures without counsel.
Wow, do you have, how do we move from a gloomy, what would,
Well, I think, as you know, Wendy and Eleanor have phrased it beautifully and captured most of the point. I mean, I do think if you look at the tornado, the creation, there's a consistency in the chaos. You know, whether you look at the refugee program, you know, the unaccompanied children's program, you know, DACA, you know, go across the board. I think, you know, often we see these actions through the lens of the program that we're working on. But if you look at the actions of this administration broadly on immigration and on vulnerable populations, they're consistent. It's creating chaos. It's administratively creating chaos. It's you know, and creating the impression of chaotic flows of migrants that are going to pose some type of threat, even if they're children, to communities in the U.S. And it's, you know, manufactured out of whole cloth. And if you look at it, you know, in terms of resources, you know, tornado has an enormous human cost to children who are kept in a desert in tents for months on end without being reunited with their parents or relatives, but also there's an enormous financial cost. You know, I think the estimates are now upwards of $1,000 per child per day to be maintained in that facility. Now, you think of what that could translate to in terms of legal representation and positive outcomes broadly for our country, for these individuals, for, you know, assessing you know, or the CAM program, or other measures that could be taken and where resources could be much more effectively used. Child protection could be advanced, you know, international, you know, agreements to which the U.S. has, you know, at least historically adhered are respected. You know, there are ways that this could be done much more effectively with the same resources. And, you know, but it is very much, as others pointed out, these are manufactured crises, and the optics of them, as bad as they are, seem to be intentional.
Can I just add one thing, just from an advocacy perspective, reflecting on what Bob just shared? You know, one thing I think those of us that kind of work inside the Beltway with Congress on the appropriations process, we tend to buy into this notion that, you're talking about, monies for HHS, there DOJ, here DHS. And, so that you immediately kind of bump up against that, well, it's not fungible. These are different appropriations processes, these are different pieces of legislation. I think from a public messaging perspective, we need to get out of that mentality, because I think for the average citizen, to put it in taxpayer dollars to share how expensive detention is, as opposed to providing a child with a lawyer to actually reach a true decision in the case more efficiently, I think we need to start changing our lexicon a bit.
Yeah, I would just chime in and I'd say, I think that there is a growing recognition that there's a need to actually address this problem holistically. I was in the room a number of years ago when Kevin, are you here? Told the Secretary of Homeland Security, then Jay Johnson, that if you try to bar the doors of a burning building, people will just jump out the windows. People are going to flee in search of safety no matter what you do. And former Secretary Johnson alluded to those comments on a number of occasions publicly. The speech I heard him give in New York, as well as in some of his public comments in the midst of the family separation crisis. I think I would be surprised if senior officials in the in the Trump administration now are not realizing, okay, we've tried so many horrific policies and they're not working. Now, that assumes that the objective here is to actually have policies that actually address the situation holistically. But you flagged, Wendy, a number of the areas that need a lot of work, and of course addressing the problems in the countries that are generating flight is critical. Former DHS Secretary Ridge co-chaired a task force recently that made very concrete recommendations about what could be done to enhance stability in countries that are generating displacement. In addition, with respect to Mexico's asylum system has many, many, many flaws, not just capacity, but in terms of recognition rates, in terms of all kinds of bars that prevent people who should be eligible for protection from actually getting protection. So there's a lot more that can be done to support the asylum systems in Mexico and in Costa Rica and in the other countries in the region as well. I would just add with one lesson learned. This administration has been really quick to move ahead with a range of policies and with regulations. And if there's another administration that comes into power one day that wants to fix these problems, they are going to need to be very quick at actually getting things done and getting regulations issued and policies to restore due process and uphold the rule of law, moving quickly. Those are my last thoughts.
Right. I was looking around to see if Lucas was here because he's got a projector on that. So our last big question, and it's something I grapple with on a daily basis in my own head, even if it's not with others, are there ways, and sometimes with others too, but are there ways, so right now it feels like at every moment we are constantly in crisis management. What's going to come tomorrow? What are we going to face? So any suggestions on how we can be proactive and problem solve during a time when it feels as if we're always being reactive?
Lunch break, I can't remember who I was talking to, it might have been Mark Greenberg, but somebody, or Carol Walter, that I think we need to take a page from this administration. I think one thing that is very clear, they had a roadmap already prepared, and they very systematically and very strategically are moving through that list and figuring out where the Achilles heels in the system are and how they can massage that, manipulate it to achieve their policy ends. I think we need to do the same. Someday this is going to change. We're already 2 years into it. We already saw the beginnings of change last week. I think time will tell what exactly that holds for the immigration issues. But I think we need to start planning now, and in terms of what are our priorities, I think there's going to have to be a certain amount of rebuilding of what we lost, but I also think it's a time to lean in and pick up where we left off and start to push some really major reforms to the immigration system. But there is one thing that I do actually think is fairly universally agreed upon, both among conservatives and liberals. Our immigration system is not particularly functional. It really needs work, and it needs to be revised for this century. So I think my main thing would be, let's start to think about that now.
I would just flag, do you want to?
No, I was just,
jump.
no, go ahead, jump. I mean, I could just say, oh, wait, after you don't. Well, okay, I'll just jump in, okay. I think we need to, as a community, however we define ourselves, have counter-suggestions, that we need to have a policy agenda that we're pursuing, even if we, we're not always very good at getting consensus among the various disparate actors, as talented and passionate as they are, around to coalesce around positions related to immigration. But I think that we do that at our peril, or fail to do that at our peril, and to be accused of, okay, open borders is the way you want to go. I think there need to be clear, that many people do have them, but I think it needs to be clear. It needs to be subscribed to by a large number of people, and the messaging around it needs to be clear, professional, and consistent. Because one thing we have seen is that this administration and its supporters, even prior to the election, were consistent in their message and the way they demonized these populations broadly, and it was effective. And I think it wasn't taken seriously. There was not an effective counter-narrative. And I think that's something we need to be considered about, and I think it needs to be professional. It just can't, I think pulling at the heartstrings is important because it's real. It's people are being harmed at every level, but there are also messages that do resonate and that resonate in different places. Family separation hit in a very powerful way, as it should have. But families are being separated across the spectrum of immigration programs, not in a way that has the same optics, but whether it's the refugee program or other aspects of immigration policy, the same effects are being felt. And I think it behooves us to find ways to both bring the passion and the tragedy and the policy alternatives to a broad public in a way that's going to resonate. And I think that can be done.
I was just going to urge that we be bolder in our messaging. I know Women's Refugee Commission did some polling lately that revealed really strong support from the American people for for protecting refugees who are seeking asylum and for use of programs like the Family Case Management Program instead of much more costly detention. And we can be clearer, I think, about the fact that we're facing a refugee and displacement situation and challenges in the region, and that there's a way to deal with those, and it's not the way that this administration is addressing the problems. And we've got to, because right behind the Central American refugee flight, we have people fleeing Nicaragua, many people who fled from Venezuela. If other countries start to follow the example the United States is setting, there will be even greater stability and more people fleeing from the places where they have temporary refuge now. So we've got to do it, and we've got to get it right.
All right, so what questions do you have for the panelists? Yeah, do you want to come to a, okay, I can repeat it for everyone.
So several speakers mentioned the need to have a more holistic policy instead of those. So Honduras is, I think, around number 140 out of 180 in the UN Human Development Index. Haiti is number 170. There's no amount of foreign aid anchoring that's going to alleviate or mitigate that difference in our lifetimes. So what can we propose? Special quotas, immigrant visas per year, or people from the poorest of countries. Right now, the effort to shoehorn into the category of refugee or asylee people whose lives are generally insecure and miserable and poor. What can we propose? Any suggestions in a positive that's
I can start, and Wendy, you may want to weigh in because of the work that you all are doing in the region. So, I've spoken, one program I've heard of, and you may even know, Wendy, more about it because I've talked to Sonia Nazario about this program in Honduras that was designed specifically in a particular area to reduce the number, to address gang violence, to get kids out of gangs. And this was an area that was generated from which many of the kids who were coming here seeking protection had come from. And the program, which was a U.S.-supported program, actually made significant progress in reducing the number of kids who actually needed to go to flee, because the program was actually able to improve the safety of those kids and keep them out of gangs. So, just throwing money at countries that are already abusing rights is not the answer. But being really focused about what programs are actually improving the rule of law, improving accountability. It's not going to be something that's solved overnight, but there have been effective programs that are making a difference. And we need to really drill down and look at those. And it's in the U.S. self-interest to do so, as well as being a step that will improve rights protections for people in those countries.
Yeah, and just to clarify my remarks from earlier, I don't see protection and addressing the root causes of the migration as an either or. It's got to be a both. Addressing the root causes it has to be a long-term strategy. These are issues that are not going to be resolved overnight. And, as Eleanor is saying, I think a lot of those solutions can be community-based in these countries and start to see what works and start to replicate that across communities. We have one project in the region to address sexual and gender-based violence, which is one of the main drivers of migration out of the region, working with school systems in the country to educate young people about reproductive health, their rights, and we're having really a very positive response. Now, we're not a huge NGO. We're not Save the Children or IRC or some of the others who do this kind of work, but I think it is demonstrating that if you kind of strategically invest community by community, we can start to turn some things around.
Yeah, I have a question. Actually, wanted to kind of speak more to you about what you were saying about really changing the language, because in the immigration space here, we see it as a domestic issue. But the reality is that it's not either or, it's both. And to go back to your example about closing the door of a burning building, I think we also have to remember that although the U.S. might have not started the fire, it surely provided the match and the fuel for that fire to get going on a continual basis, not this administration, but previous administration. An example being what the U.S. did in Honduras to promote the current conditions of the government that is creating such an untenable situation that people had to flee in caravan, right? So I think that my question to the panelists, Wendy, you mentioned a little bit of what you're doing to change the language, but what specifically would you give suggestions for organizations that are in that immigration space, and for those that are in the international or foreign policy space? How do we bridge that here so that we can begin doing a more holistic approach and understanding that, things such as CAFTA, NAFTA, the Alliance for Prosperity, the Plan Merida, all of those have impacts of migration. And what gets lost in a lot of this stuff is the protection, because as people were wondering about this caravan, they were talking about conspiracy theories, but never really focused on what was the most important, which were people were fleeing violence.
Yeah, and I would add to your list another example of how the U.S. at least should adopt a policy of do no harm is actually the gang violence in the region originates from the gangs that began to blossom here in the United States, and then because of our immigration policies, we deported those gang members back where they found an even more fertile environment to build on their activities. So one of the things that I think we need to work on is, even though Central America is not that far from the U.S., I do think that there's not a deep public understanding of the region, including some of the issues that you flagged. So I think we need to work on bringing that home to more Americans so they have more of an understanding of what's happening in the region. I remember in 2014, There was a congressional delegation, Senate delegation that went down to Honduras, and I think it was Senator Johnson from Wisconsin. I hope I'm not maligning him, but inaccurately, but who came back and said, well, these are countries that, you know, the beaches are beautiful and people go down there on vacation. So why don't we just create jobs in the resorts and all those kids can stay home? We need to really, I think, bring home to people how epidemic the violence is in the region and the impact that it has on children and families who are being very specifically targeted.
You mentioned ACLU bringing suit against the most recent executive action. Are there other legal actions that are being taken on some of these other policies that you can point to? And I just wanted to mention TPS. It hasn't been discussed, and it's a very great concern among immigrant communities. People are terrified of what the consequences might be.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. So I think I mentioned there's also a lawsuit on the turnbacks. I think there's, been a number of different lawsuits. I know we'll see additional lawsuits. But I just want to also flag the crucial importance of representation in individual cases. So right now, you know, this, until it's enjoined, this latest scheme to block from asylum people who cross between ports of entry is impacting people as we speak. I mean, there are people who have been taken into custody after, you know, crossing between the ports of entry who are being subjected to this heightened screening standard now without any legal counsel, without any legal representation. Many of these people are, you know, the adults in particular, are at facilities where there's no one who sees you until you maybe get to a master calendar, you know, and you get into the LOP program. So just flagging the importance of representation in individual cases. And I couldn't agree more on TPS. TPS is hugely important, and the impact on the people and the families who are returned, if the people who, the countries, it is absolutely terrifying. And I don't have any great answers other than to keep fighting. And thankfully, the courts have been helpful in some ways so far. So, yeah, thanks for raising it.
Can I just also, since I'm not in, I don't have anything in that game, but, you know, for those who are involved in philanthropy, funding strategic litigation, you know, because not only direct service, which tests, you know, and provides the basis for that, but, you know, there have been very successful challenges to some of the actions of this administration in the courts. And I think that's, you know, that's one approach that my colleagues here and others have been broadly engaged in, and it's informed by the direct service work they do as well. And I think, you know, look, that's, once again, it's not a silver bullet, but it's one strong import. We still have rule of law, and we have courts that are hearing these cases, and we have, you know, actions of this administration around these issues which have been deemed to be illegal. And I think, you know, but that requires lawyers working on these cases consistently and with resources and in a way that allows them the time to really do it. So I think, you know, for those of you who are not doing this work but who know the funders, I think it demonstrates time and time again where these, you know, these investments bear fruit in the protection of vulnerable individuals.
Can I jump in on that one really fast? Just, I was actually going to say something very similar, but what I'll add as well is, I think to your point, I think a lot of folks, I get asked often, why aren't you litigating more? And part of it is bandwidth, and so to the point of counsel and pro bono counsel, for the Hogan levels or the firms that have an experience with this, this is a great way to provide like strategic litigation support. Because honestly, the nonprofits of the public interest organizations just don't have the bandwidth to keep up with every single action that's happening is probably a litigatable action, but and frankly, I'm also anticipating quite a few other things that not even related to asylum coming down the pike in the very near future. But finding, you know, the the skill that, because that's not a skill that, I think that's a skill that we're growing in the pro bono, or in the public interest organizations. For so long, immigration was so administratively focused, and it's only been over the past few years where litigation's the answer. So I just wanted to jump in and say that it's a need.
The other thing I would add to that is, as a community, getting a better handle on the synergy between individual case representation and impact litigation. Matter of AB is one interesting example where I think back to the days when CGRS, Harvard, Tahirih were working on FGM, developing positive jurisprudence on cases involving FGM, then domestic violence. Now we have matter of AB as an overlay on these, social group, non-state actor type claims to be very strategic about individual casework to start to build a jurisprudence that takes us back in a more positive direction. The other thing, I was thinking about saying this during the last panel, that I think is interesting on the family separation crisis, something has become very evident, which is there is not a strong coordination function among legal service providers to work together to ensure that these families received representation as they were reunified and released, or even deported in some cases. I think that's a bit of a canary in the coal mine, because that, as horrific as that situation was, at the end of the day, it was only 2,600 or so cases. And if you look at something like TPS ending, we are going to need to have that kind of efficient network in place to ensure that we connect as many people as possible to counsel. Interestingly, because of the VERA relationship with ORR, the unaccompanied children's representation has more of that structure in place. And it's something that I have to admit, I kind of took for granted when I started at Kind, but realize now that we need to build that out and make it more extensive.
Thank you. I'm Rachel Carrillo, and I'm a writer. I've worked on the Thai-Burma border, and I've worked with migrant children of migrant workers from Burma in the past. My question is directed to Mr. Carey, but it's for each of you to weigh in. You mentioned the messaging of the other side and demonizing immigrant children, immigrant families, and how that may be leading to the success of their rapid legal measures. And you stressed the need to have messaging from the other side that's, I would assume, humanizing rather than demonizing the truth and the humanity behind immigrant peoples and why they migrate. And my question is, what does that message look like to you? We have current day amazing partnerships outside of the usual actors and players in refugee and immigrant services. For example, the Tent Partnership for Refugees, it's bringing in major corporations and businesses to support refugees and hiring refugees and support refugee service programs like WeWork and Airbnb and Starbucks and a lot of other bigger companies. And do they play a role increasingly in helping us humanize and not demonize and welcome people who are seeking safety? And so again, I'm just, what is that message and who's crafting it?
I think it needs to be crafted. I think your question is an excellent one, because I think there needs to be a movement. And I think right now there are a lot of different movements, and they're not terribly coherent. And even though many of the actors, as an example, know that the message abolish ICE alienates the majority of the people in this country, it's still a consistent message that you hear from a lot of actors. I think there are, we saw around the family separation an enormous energy and passion. But, it was powerful, but, as an example, a lot of funders were funding multiple different databases that weren't coordinated. And I think that we need to be better. We need to be better organized, whether it's philanthropy or the business community. There are a lot of silos in this field. And whether it's those working on TPS versus unaccompanied children or refugees, or, you know, and I do think that there are opportunities to work across these populations and to work in concert with business and in concert with advocates. You know, more needs to be done. I mean, I think organizations are doing it. I'm working on it myself. There's a lot of room under that big tent. But I think we all need to be considerate about it. You know, that we are part of a larger community. How do we bring our various talents to bear on a larger movement to combat what is clearly a concerted and organized movement in opposition to immigrants and refugees and all the vulnerable populations we serve. So I don't know if that's a clear answer, but I think there needs to be a movement. I see the beginnings of it across a lot of actors, but I think functions, convenings like this are important elements of bringing disparate groups and people together and looking at ways that they can work in a more intentional and cogent and organized way. And I think, you know, I look at what Wendy and Eleanor do and the organizations that they work in concert with do, and they've made vast strides in recent months and years, and I think there's a lot more work that can be done in that regard, and that it will bear fruit if it's done.
All right. Oh,
Just one more?
of course.
Yeah. Kevin Appleby, Center for Migration Studies. The exact analogy that I used was our deterrence policy were like firemen going to a burning building and locking the doors. And I actually didn't know it had such a profound effect on him. He certainly didn't show it during the meeting. But the copyright for that actually goes to Michelle Bernet of the Women's Commission. She originated that, so I think I owe her a couple of royalty checks, probably. But I do have a question, and the question is that there wasn't a mention of what a regional protection system might look like as one of the elements in this mix of policies that we need to look at. I know UNHCR had a meeting in San Pedro Sula a couple years ago, I think, where countries in the region came together, made some commitments, and it just doesn't seem like anything has come of that. And first of all, what would a regional protection system look like? And then why hasn't it gained any traction among the governments? And we know why it hasn't in our current government, but in the region, why hasn't that been a solution that's been proposed?
I mean, yeah, I'm happy to start on that. So, I mean, I think that there has been some progress, but it's been awfully slow. So, I mean, if you take Mexico, for example, in Mexico, part of a regional solution is for countries to have effective asylum systems. And so you're dealing with a whole range of hurdles, everything from corruption, everything from mismanagement, and just extreme underfunding of their system there. But, you know, my understanding is that UNHCR is raising more money to increase protection in Mexico and to increase staffing for COMAR, which is the asylum adjudication agency there. And that's really important. I mean, if this administration really cared about making it possible for more people to choose to apply for asylum in Mexico, it would be massively increasing its contributions to UNHCR to do that. So I think that in a number of the other countries like Costa Rica and Panama, I mean, there has been some progress, but, you know, in those countries too are not adequately staffed and funded. In addition, they're now facing refugees coming from Nicaragua and as well as from Venezuela. So this is huge and overwhelming and is going to require a massive amount of money to build protection in these countries. In addition, the other challenges are integration challenges. So I know, for example, one of among the programs UNHCR has been working on are ways to help make sure that people who are granted asylum, for example, in Mexico, can actually get a job, can actually work. And so I think they focused on one or two different areas. I don't know if Alice is still here, but one or two different parts of areas in Mexico where they are trying to actually build programs that make it more possible for refugees to actually integrate there. And a number of the countries in the region are very serious, Costa Rica included, about wanting to make strides. Others are not that committed or don't want to admit, for example, that they have huge rights violations and challenges, that there are massive levels of internal displacement. We're talking about a couple of countries where, that are generating flight, where the countries themselves are massive human rights abusers, as we've discussed. And now we've got like a major, change. The government of Brazil too. I mean, so what kind of anti-asylum, anti-refugee policies will we now see there? So I think that there has been some commitment. There's been some movement. The refugee compact. Kevin, I don't know if you want to update people on what happened yesterday, but the U.S. has not been totally supportive. Let's put it that way. Even though the kind of cooperation and collaboration between countries in the region and countries in the Americas is exactly what the United States needs and should be wholly supportive of.
Alice, did you want to add anything to that, or are you good?
I can say very quickly that the integration efforts, the employment efforts in Mexico have been, the idea has been to relocate refugees from the southern part of Mexico to more industrialized areas in Mexico. And for the small number of refugees who've been in this program, it's been pretty successful, and they haven't then, there have been very high rates of people staying in those areas and not moving onwards to across the US border. But I think the numbers are still pretty low.
Thanks.
Can I just add one comment, which is, I'm thinking back actually to the time when I met Don Kerwin in the Haitian refugee crisis in the early 90s, and there was a great effort at that time by the U.S. government to seek out countries in the Caribbean to host Haitians while they were processed. And I remember the Bahamas, Turks and Caicos, Jamaica, they were all approaching. We ended up using cruise ships in Guantanamo Bay, which I understand is actually back in play, is the use of Gitmo for Central Americans and Venezuelans. So, or under discussion, I mean. And, I think one thing it's so basic, but I think it's worth mentioning, is for countries in the region who don't have nearly the resources that the United States have, they are not going to step up unless we step up. So it can't be an effort to push people back into Mexico and say to Mexico, take care of our problem, or Panama or Costa Rica. It really will require great investment from us first and foremost.
Yeah. And setting a good example.
So we're actually out of time, but I think we will hang out during the break unless Don wants to give a reprieve. We'll hang out during the break for you. Okay. All right, thank you, everyone. I think we have a 15-minute break. Is that right? 3 o'clock, yes.